Homosexuality, the Bible, and God's inclusive love, unraveling mistranslations and embracing nature's diversity. For centuries, the Bible has been wielded as a weapon against homosexuality, with certain passages cited as evidence of divine condemnation. Yet a closer look at the original text reveals a compelling case. The word homosexuality, as we understand it today, may not even belong in the Bible. Instead, what many interpret as prohibitions against same-sex relationships could actually be mistranslations referring to pedophilia, a very different act rooted in exploitation, not consensual love. Beyond this, nature itself offers a profound testament to diversity through hermaphrodite animals and sex-changing amphibians, suggesting that gender and sexual fluidity are part of creation's design. At its core, Jesus' message of love, acceptance, and forgiveness stands in stark contrast to the bigotry often espoused by the religious right, reminding us that we are all God's creations, loved as we are, imperfections and all. The mistranslation that shifted culture. Take Romans 1:27, often quoted to condemn homosexuality. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust, one toward another. Men with men working that which is unseemly. KJV. On the surface, it seems to describe same-sex relationships, but dig into the historical and linguistic context, and the picture shifts. Scholars like Ed Oxford and Kathy Baldock, featured in the documentary 1946, The Mistranslation That Shifted Culture, argue that the Greek terms used in the New Testament, such as arsenokoitai in 1 Corinthians 6:9 and 1 Timothy 1:10, were mistranslated in modern Bibles to mean homosexuals. In reality, these words likely referred to exploitative practices, particularly pederasty, a common custom in the ancient world where adult men engaged in sexual relationships with young boys. This mistranslation gained traction in 1946 with the Revised Standard Version, RSV, of the Bible, the first English translation to explicitly use homosexual. Earlier translations, like Martin Luther's 1534 German Bible, used terms like Knabenschänder, literally boy molester, indicating a focus on pedophilia, not consensual same-sex relationships. The shift to homosexual in the 20th century coincided with cultural anxieties about sexuality, amplified by the religious right during the AIDS epidemic and beyond. By 1971, the RSV corrected this to sexual perverts, but the damage was done. Decades of anti-gay theology had taken root, fueled by a linguistic error. Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, often cited from the Old Testament, face similar scrutiny. The Hebrew phrase translated as lie with a man as with a woman may have been tied to specific cultural practices, like temple prostitution or incestuous abuse, rather than a blanket condemnation of homosexuality. In short, the Bible doesn't explicitly address loving mutual same-sex relationships as we know them today. It condemns exploitation and idolatry, not orientation. Nature's testimony, trans and fluidity as divine creations. If Scripture's stance is ambiguous, nature speaks loudly. The animal kingdom is rife with examples of sexual and gender diversity, challenging rigid human binaries. Hermaphrodite animals, like earthworms, snails, and certain fish, possess both male and female reproductive organs, thriving in their dual nature. Sex-changing amphibians, such as the clownfish, which can switch from male to female, and some frog species, whose sex can shift due to environmental factors, demonstrate that fluidity is woven into creation's fabric. Even among mammals, same-sex behavior is documented in over 1,500 species, from dolphins to bonobos, often serving social or bonding purposes. To the religious right, who often claim God's design is strictly heterosexual and binary, these examples pose a question. If God created all things, didn't he create this diversity too? The Bible declares in Genesis 1:31 that God saw all he made and called it good. Hermaphrodites, trans species, and same-sex pairings aren't aberrations. They're part of the tapestry of life, suggesting that variation is intentional, not accidental. Jesus' message, love over judgment. Jesus never mentioned homosexuality, not once. His ministry, however, overflowed with love, acceptance, and forgiveness. In John 8:7, when a crowd sought to stone an adulterous woman, he challenged them, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." The accusers dispersed, convicted by their own flaws. In Matthew 22:39, he distilled God's law into two commands, love God and love your neighbor. This radical inclusivity welcomed tax collectors, prostitutes, and outcasts, people the religious elite despised. Contrast this with the religious right's often vitriolic stance against the LGBTQ+ community. Their rhetoric casts stones, not compassion, ignoring that we're all God's creations. If God is perfect and doesn't err, as they assert, then he made queer people exactly as they are, just as he made the hateful, the hypocritical, and the self-righteous. Psalm 139:14 says, "I am fearfully and wonderfully made." That applies to everyone, not just the heteronormative. The closeted hypocrisy of hate. Ironically, those loudest in their condemnation often harbor their own struggles. Psychological studies suggest that homophobia can stem from repressed same-sex attraction, a phenomenon dubbed internalized homophobia. This self-hatred projects outward, targeting others as a defense mechanism. The pattern repeats in high-profile scandals. Republican figures preaching family values while entangled in gay controversies. Take Larry Craig, the Idaho senator arrested in 2007 for soliciting sex in a men's restroom, or Ted Haggard, the evangelical leader exposed in 2006 for a relationship with a male escort. More recently, Madison Cawthorn, the young disabled North Carolina congressman, claimed in 2022 that GOP insiders invited him to orgies, a glimpse into the hidden contradictions of party elites. Then there's the curious case of Grindr, the gay hookup app crashing during Republican national conventions. In 2016 and 2020, users reported outages in host cities, hinting at a surge of closeted attendees seeking discreet encounters. The hypocrisy is palpable, public condemnation paired with private indulgence. It's a cycle of self-loathing turned outward, punishing others for what they cannot accept in themselves. God's love transcends human bigotry. Ultimately, the religious right's fixation on homosexuality clashes with the heart of Christianity. If we're all God's creations, crafted with intent, flaws and all, then his love extends to every soul, queer or straight, saint or sinner. Romans 5:8 affirms, God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Jesus didn't gatekeep salvation. He offered it freely, urging us to do the same. The mistranslation of Scripture doesn't erase this truth, nor does nature's diversity undermine it. Bigotry and stone-throwing stem from human fear, not divine mandate. To the religious right, a reminder. Your hate, too, is part of God's creation, a flaw he loves you through, just as he loves those you scorn. Jesus calls us to drop the stones, embrace the outcast, and live the gospel of love, not division. Anything less is a betrayal of the message they claim to uphold. By Scott Young, aka Sinfamous Gamer.